It was a few years ago, sometime in late fall. I remember the air was crisp with that cold bite you feel when you step out of a warm house into the night. I had just left a friend's place after watching a movie, something about aliens or ghosts. I can't even recall. It was late, around midnight, and I had a long drive home ahead of me. I lived in a small town outside of Seattle, about an hour's drive from where I was. The drive started off uneventfully. The roads were nearly empty, and I made good time getting out of the city. Once I got onto the rural highways, the traffic thinned out completely. It was just me, the road, and the fog that had started rolling in as I left the city behind. I've driven in fog before, but this was different. It was thick, almost like a wall, and my headlights barely cut through it. The light reflected off the fog, making it even harder to see what was ahead. I slowed down, keeping my eyes focused on the road as much as I could. The twisting highways around here were notorious for accidents, especially in bad weather. I wasn't taking any chances. After about 20 minutes of driving through the fog, I started to get that uneasy feeling in my gut. You know, the kind that tells you something's off, but you can't quite figure out what. The road seemed to stretch on forever, with no signs of life. No other cars, no houses, nothing but the trees looming on either side, their shapes barely visible through the mist. I was beginning to think I should have stayed the night at my friend's place when my headlights suddenly caught something up ahead. It was a car, stationary on the side of the road with its hazard lights blinking. The fog made it hard to tell exactly what was going on, but I could see that the car was positioned awkwardly, almost as if it had stopped in the middle of the lane. I slowed down even more, my pulse quickening as I approached. I didn't see any movement inside the car, and for a moment, I wondered if it was just abandoned. But as I got closer, I noticed the driver's side door was slightly ajar, and through the window I could see a figure slumped over the steering wheel. My first thought was that it was a medical emergency. Maybe the driver had had a heart attack or something. I pulled over to the side of the road and parked a few yards behind the car, leaving my engine running. The fog seemed even thicker now, muffling all sound, and the whole scene felt eerily silent. I grabbed my phone and stepped out of my car, the cold air biting at my face. As I walked towards the car, I tried to call 911, but there was no signal. I wasn't surprised. This stretch of highway was notorious for bad reception. I kept moving, hoping I could at least help the person until I found a signal. When I reached the driver's side, I hesitated for a moment before peering in. The driver was a man, middle-aged, and he was completely unresponsive. His head was leaning forward against the steering wheel, and his breathing was shallow. I quickly checked for any visible injuries, but I didn't see any blood or anything that might indicate an accident. I didn't know much about first aid, but I knew I had to do something. My mind was racing as I tried to figure out what could have happened. Was he drunk? Had he passed out from exhaustion? I needed to get him out of the car and see if I could wake him up. But before I could act, I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. It was the sound of another car approaching, and it was coming fast. I looked up and squinted through the fog, trying to make out the source of the noise. The headlights were barely visible, just two faint pinpoints of light growing brighter by the second. Panic set in as I realized that the car might not see us in time to stop. The highway was narrow and the fog was so thick that any driver would have a hard time spotting us until it was too late. I acted on instinct. I yanked the man's door open, but his seatbelt was still on. My hands fumbled as I reached across him to unbuckle it, the cold metal of the buckle making my fingers numb. The sound of the approaching car grew louder, and I could hear the engine now, roaring through the fog. I was running out of time. I finally managed to free the man from his seatbelt and started to pull him out of the car. He was heavier than I expected, and I struggled to support his weight as I dragged him toward the side of the road. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins. Just as I reached the edge of the road, the approaching car's headlights cut through the fog, blinding me for a moment. I turned my head away, still pulling the man with me. The car was almost on top of us now, and I could see it swerving slightly as if the driver had just noticed the hazard lights. I braced myself for the impact, expecting the worst, but at the last second the car swerved hard to the left, missing the abandoned vehicle by inches. The sound of screeching tires filled the air as the car fishtailed, narrowly avoiding a collision. I could only watch, frozen in place, as the car sped off into the fog, disappearing from sight as quickly as it had come. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The man was still unconscious, and I was kneeling beside him on the cold, wet ground. The reality of how close we had come to disaster began to sink in, and my hands started to shake uncontrollably. I knew I had to get help, but the road was empty again, and I still had no signal. I couldn't just leave the man there, so I decided to try to move him to my car. I wasn't sure how I was going to do it, but I didn't have any other options. As I started to lift him again, I heard another sound, a faint rumbling that seemed to come from the direction the other car had gone. I froze, my ears straining to catch the noise. It was hard to tell in the fog, but it sounded like the car had stopped not too far down the road. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to just focus on getting the man to safety. But something about the sound made me uneasy. I gently laid the man back down and stood up, trying to peer through the fog in the direction the car had gone. The rumbling grew louder, and I realized it wasn't just one sound, it was two. The first sound was definitely a car engine, but the second was more of a deep, low growl, like something heavy scraping against the road. My pulse quickened as the sounds grew closer, and I realized with a sinking feeling that whatever was making the noise was heading back towards us. I quickly moved back to the unconscious man, trying to lift him again, but he was too heavy. I managed to get him halfway up before I heard the noise again, much closer this time. The growling sound was unmistakable now, a low, menacing rumble that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I was torn between trying to get the man into my car and just running for it. The fog made it impossible to see what was coming, and I didn't want to leave him alone, but the sound was getting closer and closer. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I looked around, desperate for a way out. Then, out of the fog, I saw the faint outline of something large and dark moving towards us. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized it was another car, moving slowly this time, almost as if it was searching for something. The growling noise was louder than ever, and it seemed to be coming from the same direction. I backed away from the man, my eyes locked on the approaching vehicle. It was hard to make out any details in the fog, but I could see that the car's headlights were off, making it nearly invisible. The growling noise grew louder, and I realized it was coming from something attached to the back of the car, something heavy and metallic. The car continued to approach, and I could see now that it was dragging something behind it, something that scraped and rattled against the road. My stomach turned as I realized what it was: chains. The car was dragging a long length of heavy chains behind it, the metal links clinking and scraping against the pavement. I didn't have time to think. I turned and ran, leaving the unconscious man behind. My car was only a few yards away, but it felt like miles as I sprinted towards it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the car behind me, the chains clattering louder and louder, and I knew I had only seconds to get away. I reached my car and yanked the door open, diving inside and slamming it shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the key into the ignition. I could hear the car with the chains now, so close that it felt like it was right on top of me. Finally, I managed to start my car, the engine roaring to life. I slammed it into gear and hit the gas, the tires spinning on the wet road before finally catching traction. The car lurched forward and I sped off into the fog, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the car with the chains following me, but there was nothing. Just the impenetrable wall of fog behind me. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and silent once more. I didn't stop driving until I reached the outskirts of the nearest town. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still trembling as I parked the car. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down and process what had just happened. When I finally felt like I could move again, I got out of the car and went inside the gas station, hoping to find a phone or someone who could help. The clerk behind the counter gave me a strange look as I stumbled in, but he didn't say anything. I asked if I could use the phone, and he pointed me towards the back of the store. I called 911 and told them about the unconscious man and the car with the chains. The dispatcher seemed concerned, but she didn't have much to go on, just a vague description of a car in the fog and a man who needed help. She said she would send someone to check it out, but I could tell she wasn't sure what to make of my story. I stayed at the gas station until the police arrived, a single patrol car that seemed far too small and inadequate for what had just happened. The officer took my statement, but there wasn't much he could do. The fog had cleared by then, but there was no sign of the car or the unconscious man when they went to check the area. They told me that they'd keep an eye out, but I could tell they didn't expect to find anything. I couldn't blame them. It all sounded so unreal, even to me. But I knew what I had seen and heard, and the memory of those chains scraping against the road still haunts me. I never found out what happened to the man or who was driving that car. The police never contacted me about it again, and I eventually stopped asking. A couple of years ago, I decided to take a solo road trip through the Pacific Northwest. It was something I'd always wanted to do, just me, my car, and the open road. The plan was to start in Seattle, head through the Cascades, and then wind my way down into Oregon, taking in the sights along the way. I'd planned out my route pretty carefully, making sure to hit some scenic spots and a few small towns that I'd read about online. The trip was going well at first. I spent a couple of days hiking around Mount Rainier, then made my way east through the Cascades, soaking in the views and enjoying the solitude. I wasn't in a rush, so I took my time, stopping whenever I felt like it to check out a viewpoint or snap a photo. It was one of those trips where everything just feels right. Perfect weather, beautiful scenery, and not a care in the world. But things took a turn when I decided to drive through the mountains south of Leavenworth. There's a stretch of highway there that's known for its stunning views, but also for its steep, winding roads. I'd read about it before I left, but I figured it couldn't be that bad, especially since the weather was clear and the roads were dry. The drive started off fine. The road was narrow and hugged the side of the mountain with a sheer drop on one side and towering cliffs on the other. It was nerve-wracking, sure, but the views were incredible. I could see for miles, the mountains stretching out in all directions, with patches of snow still clinging to the highest peaks. The road wound its way down the mountainside with sharp turns and steep descents, but I was confident I could handle it. Then about halfway down, I noticed something was off with my car. I was coming around a particularly sharp curve when I felt the brake pedal go soft under my foot. It was subtle at first, just a slight give, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I tested the brakes a couple more times as I continued down the road, and each time they felt weaker, less responsive. Panic started to set in as I realized what was happening. My brakes were failing, and I was still miles from the bottom of the mountain. There were no guardrails on this stretch of road, just a sheer drop on one side and a rock wall on the other. One wrong move, and I could easily go over the edge or slam into the mountainside. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I just needed to take it slow and steady, but the road was so steep that even at a low speed, the car kept picking up momentum. I downshifted, hoping to use the engine to slow me down, but it wasn't enough. The car continued to gain speed, and I could feel my control slipping away. Ahead of me, the road curved sharply to the left, and beyond that, I could see nothing but open air. My heart was pounding in my chest as I pumped the brakes again and again, desperately trying to slow the car down, but it was no use. The pedal sank to the floor, and I realized with horror that I had no brakes left at all. I knew I had to do something fast. I was going too fast to make the turn, and if I didn't act, I was going to go right over the edge. My mind raced as I searched for a way out, and then I remembered reading about runaway truck ramps. Those gravel-covered escape lanes they put on steep mountain roads for situations just like this. I hadn't seen one yet, but I knew there had to be one somewhere up ahead. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, focusing on keeping the car on the road. The engine was roaring as the car continued to pick up speed, and the tires screeched as I tried to keep the car under control. Every muscle in my body was tense, and it felt like time had slowed down, each second stretching out into an eternity. Finally, I saw it. A small sign on the side of the road with an arrow pointing to the right, marking the entrance to a runaway truck ramp. The ramp itself was just a narrow gravel path that led up a steep incline, designed to slow down vehicles that had lost their brakes. It was my only hope. I yanked the steering wheel to the right, sending the car careening onto the ramp. The tires hit the gravel, and I felt the car lurch as the gravel slowed me down. The car bucked and jolted as I bounced up the incline, but I kept my foot off the gas, letting the ramp do its job. The car finally came to a shuddering stop near the top of the ramp, and for a moment, everything was silent. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white, and I could feel my whole body trembling with adrenaline. I just sat there for a minute, trying to catch my breath and process what had just happened. I was safe, but I was still on the side of a mountain miles from anywhere with a car that had no brakes. I knew I couldn't drive it any further, not without risking another disaster. My phone was sitting in the passenger seat, and I quickly grabbed it, praying that I had a signal. Thankfully, I did, though it was weak. I called for roadside assistance and explained my situation, and they told me they'd send a tow truck. But it could be a while given how remote I was. There wasn't much I could do but wait. The sun was starting to set, and I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. After what felt like hours, I finally heard the sound of a truck engine echoing off the mountains. I looked up and saw the tow truck making its way up the road towards me, its headlights cutting through the twilight. Relief washed over me, and for the first time since my brakes had failed, I felt like I could finally relax. The tow truck driver was a no-nonsense kind of guy, and he didn't say much as he hooked up my car and started towing it down the mountain. I rode with him in the cab, staring out the window as the darkness settled in around us. The road that had seemed so beautiful and peaceful earlier that day now felt menacing, like it was just waiting for the next unfortunate soul to make a mistake. When we finally reached the bottom of the mountain, the driver dropped me off at a small repair shop in a nearby town. The mechanic took one look at my car and shook his head, telling me that the brake lines had corroded and that I was lucky they hadn't given out completely before I hit the ramp. I ended up spending the night in that little town, waiting for the repairs to be done. A few years ago, my boyfriend and I decided to take a road trip across the southwestern United States. We had both been working crazy hours and really needed a break, so we planned out a week-long trip that would take us through some of the more remote areas of Arizona and New Mexico. We started out in Phoenix, spending a day there before hitting the road. The first couple of days were great. We drove through Sedona, checked out the Grand Canyon, and even made a quick stop in Flagstaff. The weather was perfect, clear skies and warm, but not too hot. Everything was going smoothly, and we were both enjoying the sense of freedom that comes with a road trip. On the third day, we decided to take a detour through the Arizona desert. We had heard about this scenic route that was supposed to be pretty incredible, with long stretches of empty road cutting through vast barren landscapes. It sounded exactly like what we were looking for, something off the beaten path where we wouldn't run into too many other people. We left the main highway around mid-morning, turning onto a narrow two-lane road that seemed to stretch out forever in front of us. The landscape quickly became more desolate, with nothing but scrubby desert plants and rocky hills as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely sort of way, and for a while we were both completely absorbed in the scenery. After driving for a couple of hours, we hadn't seen another car in what felt like ages. The road was completely deserted, and we hadn't passed any towns or gas stations since we'd left the highway. We weren't worried, though. We had plenty of gas, and the car was in good shape. We were just enjoying the drive, listening to music and taking in the sights. That's when we saw it. A car on the side of the road, maybe a quarter of a mile ahead. It was an old, beat-up sedan, and even from a distance, we could see that it had been there for a while. The paint was faded and rusty, and the tires looked like they had gone flat a long time ago. As we got closer, we noticed that the car's doors were wide open and there were things scattered all around it, like someone had left in a hurry. We slowed down as we approached, more out of curiosity than anything else. There was something unsettling about the scene. An abandoned car in the middle of nowhere with its doors open and personal items strewn around. We wondered if maybe someone had broken down and walked to get help. But it was odd that they hadn't closed the doors or taken their stuff with them. When we pulled up beside the car, I could see inside, and it was even weirder. There were clothes and bags scattered across the seats, and the front passenger seat had a fast food bag crumpled up on it, as if someone had been eating and then just left. The whole thing felt wrong, like we were intruding on something we weren't supposed to see. We debated whether we should stop and check it out, or just keep going. Part of me felt like we should at least make sure no one was hurt or in trouble, but another part of me just wanted to get out of there. It didn't help that the desert was eerily quiet, with no sounds except for the wind and the occasional creak of the car's metal as it settled in the heat. We finally decided to stop. My boyfriend pulled over to the side of the road and we both got out of the car. The sun was blazing down and the heat hit us like a wall as soon as we stepped out. We approached the abandoned car cautiously, not really sure what we were expecting to find. The first thing I noticed was that the engine was still warm, which was strange given how old and abandoned the car looked. It couldn't have been sitting there for long, despite its condition. We called out a couple of times, asking if anyone was around, but there was no answer. The desert swallowed up our voices, leaving nothing but silence in return. I peered into the back seat and saw more of the same, clothes, bags, and some other random stuff that looked like it had been left in a hurry. There was no sign of a struggle or anything, but the whole situation was making me increasingly uneasy. The only explanation I could come up with was that someone had gotten spooked and taken off on foot, but that didn't really make sense either. Where would they go out here in the middle of nowhere? As we were standing there trying to figure out what to do, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Our car, just moments ago, the gas gauge had been sitting at a comfortable 3/4 full. Now it was just above empty. I stared at it, not really believing what I was seeing. There was no way we could have burned through that much gas in the short time we'd been driving since our last fill-up. I called my boyfriend over, and when he saw the gauge, his expression darkened. We both knew something was very wrong, but we didn't know what. It wasn't like there was a leak. The car wasn't leaving a trail of gas behind it, and it wasn't like someone had siphoned it out while we were distracted. We would have heard or seen something. We got back into the car, suddenly feeling the urge to get out of there as quickly as possible. The unease that had been building in the pit of my stomach was now full-blown fear. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I didn't want to stick around to find out. As we pulled away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something emerge from the desert and come after us, but there was nothing. Just the abandoned car slowly fading into the distance. We drove in silence for a while, both of us too on edge to talk. The gas gauge continued to drop faster than it should have, and I started to worry that we wouldn't make it to the next town. The landscape was still empty. No buildings, no other cars, just mile after mile of desert. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and I felt a growing sense of urgency. We needed to find help before it got dark. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, we stopped at a small gas station off to the side of the road. A few years ago, I had a close call on the freeway that still makes my heart race whenever I think about it. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, working a job that had me commuting across the city every day. Anyone who spent time in LA knows how stressful the traffic can be, especially during rush hour. But this happened on a Saturday, late in the afternoon, when the traffic was lighter but still busy enough that you had to stay on your toes. I was driving back from a friend's place in Santa Monica, heading east on the 10 freeway towards downtown. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden glow over the city, and I remember thinking how nice it was to have a bit of open road in front of me for once. I wasn't in a rush, just cruising along in the middle lane, listening to music and trying to relax. After a while, I noticed a car in the lane next to me, a little bit ahead, weaving slightly. At first, I didn't think much of it. You see that kind of thing all the time, people distracted or messing around with their phones. But as I got closer, I could see that this car was really all over the place, drifting between the lanes, speeding up and then slowing down erratically. I instinctively slowed down, not wanting to get too close to whatever was going on in that car. As I did, I caught a glimpse of the driver, a young guy, maybe in his 20s, with one hand on the wheel and his other hand holding up his phone. It was obvious he was texting or doing something that was taking his attention completely off the road. The freeway was still fairly busy with cars all around us, and I could see a few other drivers also starting to keep their distance from this guy. I thought about speeding up to pass him, but he was swerving so unpredictably that I didn't want to risk getting too close. I figured my best bet was to hang back and hope he either got off the freeway or pulled himself together, but it didn't take long for things to get worse. As I watched, the driver suddenly veered sharply to the left, crossing 2 lanes of traffic in one quick, jerky movement. There was a blast of horns from the cars he nearly hit, and I could see brake lights flaring up all around him. Miraculously, he didn't collide with anyone, but my heart was pounding as I realized just how close he had come to causing a major accident. At this point, I was seriously freaked out. I started thinking about how I could report him, maybe call 911 and let them know there was a reckless driver on the road. But before I could do anything, the guy did something that made my blood run cold. He drifted back into his original lane, my lane, right in front of me, and then he slowed down, way down, to the point where he was practically crawling. I had no choice but to hit my brakes hard to avoid rear-ending him. The sudden deceleration sent my heart racing even faster, and I frantically checked my mirrors to make sure no one was about to slam into me from behind. Thankfully, the car behind me managed to slow down in time, but now I was stuck directly behind this erratic driver with no easy way out. For a moment, I considered trying to switch lanes and get around him, but the traffic on either side of me was moving too fast, and I didn't want to risk getting sideswiped. So I stayed where I was, gripping the wheel tightly and trying to keep a safe distance while praying this guy wouldn't do anything else stupid. But of course he did. Just as suddenly as he had slowed down, he hit the gas again, accelerating rapidly and swerving into the lane on my left. I watched in horror as he cut off another driver, barely avoiding a collision, and then swerved back into my lane right in front of me once more. This time, he slowed down even more, as if he was deliberately trying to mess with me. My mind was racing as I tried to figure out what the hell was going on. Was this guy drunk, high, or just an asshole who thought it was funny to scare people on the freeway? Whatever the reason, I knew I needed to get away from him, but I was boxed in by other cars and couldn't move. Then out of nowhere, he slammed on his brakes, bringing his car to an almost complete stop in the middle of the freeway. I barely had time to react. I slammed on my own brakes, my tires screeching as I struggled to avoid rear-ending him. My car fishtailed slightly as I fought to maintain control, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Somehow I managed to stop just in time, mere inches from his bumper. My entire body was trembling with adrenaline, and for a split second I just sat there, too shocked to do anything. The guy in front of me was completely still, his car idling as if nothing was wrong, while the cars behind me were honking furiously, trying to figure out what was going on. I didn't have time to think. I knew I had to get out of there before something terrible happened. I checked my mirrors again and saw a small gap in the traffic to my right. Without hesitating, I cranked the wheel and accelerated, pulling into the next lane and speeding past the guy who had nearly caused a massive pileup. As I passed him, I glanced over and saw him still holding his phone, his face completely blank, like he wasn't even aware of the chaos he was causing. It sent a chill down my spine. There was something so unsettling about how disconnected he seemed, like he was in his own world, oblivious to the danger he was putting everyone else in. I didn't look back as I sped away, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep the car steady, and it took everything I had to stay focused on the road and not break down in panic. Eventually, I managed to merge into another lane, and then another, until I was far enough ahead that I couldn't see him anymore. I don't know how long I drove like that, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, my heart racing with every car that got too close. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before I finally saw my exit coming up. I took it, more out of instinct than anything else, desperate to get off the freeway and away from that nightmare. Once I was off the freeway and back on surface streets, I pulled over into a parking lot and just sat there trying to calm down. My hands were still shaking and I realized I was drenched in sweat. It took a long time for my heart rate to return to normal and even longer before I felt like I could get back on the road. When I finally did, I took the long way home, avoiding the freeway entirely. I couldn't bring myself to get back on it, not after what had just happened. Ever since that day, I've been hyper aware of other drivers, especially on the freeway. I don't take any chances. I stay alert, keep my distance, and if I see someone acting erratically, I get away from them as quickly as possible. A couple of years ago, I had an experience on a drive home that still makes me uneasy whenever I think about it. I was living in Houston at the time, working late hours at an accounting firm. It was a typical day, long, exhausting, and I just wanted to get home, kick off my shoes, and relax. But that night, a storm rolled in just as I was getting ready to leave the office. Houston is no stranger to heavy rain, but this storm was something else. The rain was coming down in sheets and the wind was howling, making the whole city feel like it was under siege. I checked the weather before heading out and saw flood warnings popping up all over the place. I considered waiting it out at the office, but I was too tired and just wanted to be in my own bed. The drive home started off tense but manageable. The rain was relentless, but the roads were still passable and traffic was light, probably because most people had the good sense to stay off the roads. I took my usual route, which took me through a mix of highways and side streets. The visibility was awful, even with my wipers on full speed, and I had to keep my headlights on high beam just to see a few feet in front of me. About halfway home, the rain started coming down even harder, if that was possible. I could barely see the road, and the water was starting to pool in low-lying areas. I slowed down to a crawl, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I navigated through the increasingly treacherous conditions. I was about 10 minutes from home when I came to a section of road that was completely flooded. I knew the area well, and knew that this particular stretch was prone to flooding, but I'd never seen it this bad before. The water was covering the entire width of the road, and I couldn't tell how deep it was. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to turn around and find another way, but the thought of backtracking through the storm didn't appeal to me. I just wanted to get home, and I figured if I took it slow and steady, I could make it through. I'd driven through flooded roads before. How bad could it be? I eased my car forward, keeping my speed low and trying to stay in the middle of the road where the water was likely to be shallowest. The water sloshed around my tires and I could feel the car struggling to push through it. My heart was pounding, but I kept going, telling myself I'd be fine as long as I didn't stop. But then, about halfway through, the car started to slow down, and I felt a jolt of panic. The engine was still running, but the car was losing power, and the water was getting deeper. I pressed down on the gas, but the car barely responded. I was stuck right in the middle of the flood, with the water rising around me. The rain was pounding on the roof, and I could hear the water gurgling as it started to seep into the car. I tried to stay calm, thinking maybe I could back up and get out of the worst of it, but when I shifted into reverse, the car barely moved. The water was too deep, and the tires couldn't get enough traction. I was starting to panic now. The water was up to the doors, and I could feel it soaking into the carpet under my feet. I knew I had to get out before the car was completely submerged. But the thought of stepping out into that dark, swirling water was terrifying. I could barely see anything outside, just the outline of trees and buildings blurred by the rain. I took a deep breath and tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The pressure of the water outside was too strong. I felt trapped, like the car was a metal coffin filling up with water, and for a moment I was paralyzed with fear. The water was rising fast, and I could feel it creeping up my legs, soaking through my clothes. I knew I didn't have much time. I fumbled with my seatbelt, unbuckling it and trying to think clearly. My phone was sitting in the cup holder, but there was no point in trying to call for help. There was no way anyone could get to me in time. My only option was to get out and hope I could make it to higher ground. I leaned back and kicked at the door with all my strength. It didn't move at first, but I kept kicking, adrenaline surging through me. Finally, the door gave way, opening just enough for me to squeeze through. Cold, filthy water rushed in, drenching me as I scrambled out of the car and into the flood. The water was up to my waist, and the current was stronger than I expected. It tugged at me, trying to pull me down as I fought to keep my balance. The rain was still coming down in sheets, and I could barely see where I was going, but I knew I had to get to higher ground. I started wading towards the nearest building, a small strip mall that was slightly elevated above the road. The water was pulling at my legs, making every step a struggle, but I forced myself to keep moving. I could feel the current getting stronger, and I knew that if I lost my footing, I'd be swept away. It felt like an eternity, but I finally reached the edge of the parking lot where the water was shallower. I stumbled onto the pavement, gasping for breath, and collapsed on the ground. The rain was still pouring down, but I was out of the worst of it, at least for the moment. I sat there for a while, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. My car was still out there in the flood, barely visible through the rain. I knew it was a lost cause. There was no way it would survive being submerged like that. But I didn't care about the car anymore. I was just thankful to be alive. Eventually, I made my way to one of the stores in the strip mall where I found shelter and called for help. A few years ago, I was driving back from a weekend trip to visit family in the rural parts of Pennsylvania. It was a long drive, and I had planned to leave earlier in the day, but one thing led to another, and I ended up hitting the road much later than I'd intended. By the time I was halfway home, the sun had already set, and I found myself on a lonely stretch of highway with nothing but the dark woods on either side. I wasn't too worried at first. I'd driven this route plenty of times before, and while it was isolated, it was also pretty straightforward. The road was empty except for the occasional semi-truck rumbling by, and I figured I'd make it home by midnight if I kept a steady pace. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something up ahead, a figure on the side of the road, barely visible in the beam of my headlights. As I got closer, I realized it was a man, standing there with his thumb out, trying to hitch a ride. It was unusual to see a hitchhiker out here, especially at this time of night, but I'd always been cautious about picking up strangers. So I slowed down just enough to get a better look at him as I passed. He looked rough, like he'd been out there for a while. His clothes were dirty, and he was shifting from foot to foot, looking over his shoulder every few seconds as if he was nervous about something. For a split second, I considered stopping to see if he needed help, but something about the way he was acting made me uneasy. So I kept driving, figuring someone else would come along and give him a ride. But as I passed him, I caught a glimpse of his face in my rearview mirror. He wasn't just nervous, he looked terrified. It was only for a second, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I'd made the right decision by not stopping, but that image of his face stayed with me as I drove on. About 10 minutes later, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another car on the road. But as the lights got closer, I noticed the vehicle wasn't passing me, even though I wasn't going that fast. Instead, it was hanging back, staying just far enough behind that I couldn't make out the make or model. I thought it was odd, but I figured maybe the driver was just being cautious on these dark, winding roads. The car stayed behind me for a while, never getting too close but never backing off either. I started to feel uneasy. The road was still deserted, and there were no other cars in sight. I tried to focus on the drive, telling myself it was nothing, just another driver heading in the same direction. But then, the car sped up and started closing the distance between us. It was too close now, its headlights filling my rearview mirror and making it hard to see. I instinctively tapped the brakes, hoping the driver would get the hint and back off, but instead the car swerved slightly, as if the driver was distracted or having trouble controlling the vehicle. That's when I started to get really scared. Something was off about this whole situation, and my mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I pull over and let them pass? Speed up and try to put some distance between us? The longer I thought about it, the more I realized there was no good option. We were in the middle of nowhere, and if something went wrong, I had no one to rely on. Suddenly, the car behind me swerved again, this time crossing the center line and veering into the oncoming lane. I thought for sure they were going to try to pass me, but then they swerved back, almost hitting my bumper in the process. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline surging through me. This wasn't just a reckless driver, something else was going on. I decided to speed up, hoping to lose them, but the car behind me matched my speed, staying right on my tail. I was pushing my car as fast as I dared on these dark, unfamiliar roads, but no matter how fast I went, they stayed with me, their headlights glaring in my mirrors. Then, out of nowhere, the car behind me turned off its headlights. The sudden darkness was disorienting, and for a moment, I couldn't see anything behind me. I had no idea where the car had gone or what the driver was planning, and the fear that had been building in me turned into full-blown panic. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the empty darkness behind me. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some sort of plan, but I felt trapped. I couldn't pull over, I couldn't outrun them, and I had no idea what they were going to do next. Then, without warning, the headlights flicked back on, right behind me again. The car was so close now that I could almost feel it bumping my rear bumper. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white, and prayed that I wouldn't lose control of the car. Finally, I saw a small turnoff up ahead, a narrow dirt road that led into the woods. It was a gamble, but I knew I had to do something to get away from this maniac. As I approached the turnoff, I slowed down just enough to make the sharp turn, my tires skidding on the loose gravel as I veered off the main road. For a moment, I thought I might have lost them. I sped down the dirt road, the trees closing in around me, hoping the car would keep going and leave me behind. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw those same headlights following me down the narrow path. They hadn't given up. I was desperate now, trying to figure out where this road led and how I could get away. The trees were thick on either side and the road was getting rougher with deep ruts and potholes that made it hard to keep my speed up. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer without risking a crash. Then, up ahead I saw a small clearing and I realized the road was about to end. My heart sank as I realized I'd led myself into a dead end. There was nowhere left to go. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the clearing. The other car was right behind me, its headlights still glaring. I had no idea what they wanted, but I knew I had to get out of there before they reached me. I threw the car into reverse, planning to backtrack down the road and hope I could find another way out, but before I could move, the other car swerved to block the road, trapping me. I was completely cornered. There was no way out, and I could feel the terror rising in my chest as I realized just how bad this situation had become. The other car's engine was still running, and I could see the silhouette of the driver inside, but they weren't moving. They were just sitting there waiting. I had no idea what they were planning to do, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to dial 911, but I had no signal. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was completely on my own. In a panic, I locked the doors and tried to think of some way out. My eyes were darting around the clearing, looking for anything that could help me. But there was nothing but trees and darkness. I could feel the seconds ticking by, each one bringing me closer to whatever was about to happen. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the other car's engine revved, and they backed up slightly, clearing the road. I had no idea what they were doing, but I wasn't going to waste the opportunity. I threw my car into gear and floored it, swerving around them and racing back down the dirt road as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't care if they were following me or not. I just wanted to get away from that place as quickly as possible. My heart was pounding in my chest and I could barely breathe as I sped through the trees, praying I wouldn't crash or get stuck. When I finally made it back to the main road, I didn't stop. I kept driving, my eyes glued to the road ahead, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I had no idea who that person was or why they'd been chasing me, but I knew I couldn't risk stopping until I was far, far away. Eventually, I reached a small town and pulled into a brightly lit gas station. I parked under the lights, my hands still trembling as I sat there, trying to process what had just happened. I felt like I'd just escaped from some kind of nightmare. I waited at the gas station for a while, watching the road and trying to calm down. After what felt like hours, I finally gathered the courage to get back on the road. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze, constantly checking my mirrors, my heart skipping a beat every time I saw headlights behind me. But I didn't see that car again. A few years ago, I was driving through Detroit late at night. I had been visiting a friend on the outskirts of the city and lost track of time, so it was well past midnight when I finally decided to head home. The streets were mostly empty, and the city had that eerie quietness that only comes after dark in a place like Detroit. I was familiar with the route, but for some reason I decided to take a different way home. I wanted to avoid the highway, thinking the local roads would be quicker since there wouldn't be any traffic at that hour. It wasn't the best idea, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The streets were dark, lined with old, abandoned buildings, and the occasional flickering streetlight only added to the sense of unease. I had been driving for about 10 minutes when I noticed a car behind me. It was a dark sedan, and it wasn't there one moment, then suddenly it was right on my tail. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just another driver trying to get home. But as I continued down the road, the car stayed right behind me, too close for comfort. I made a few turns, thinking the driver would pass me or take a different route. But they didn't. They stayed right on my bumper, matching my every move. My heart started to race as I realized something wasn't right. I didn't know if they were just being aggressive or if they had some other motive, but I knew I had to get out of there. I decided to take a detour down a side street, hoping to lose them. The street was even darker than the one I had been on, with boarded-up houses and overgrown lots on either side. It was the kind of place that would make you uneasy, even in broad daylight. But at night, it was downright terrifying. The car followed me down the side street, still too close for comfort. I could feel my pulse quickening as I tried to think of what to do next. I wasn't familiar with this part of town, and the last thing I wanted was to get lost in a place like this with someone following me. I took another turn and then another, weaving through the narrow, deserted streets. But no matter where I went, the car stayed right behind me, never backing off. The headlights filled my rearview mirror, making it hard to see anything else. My mind was racing with all kinds of scenarios, none of them good. I knew I couldn't keep driving aimlessly like this. I needed to find a way to shake them off, or at least get to a more populated area where I might find help. I scanned the streets ahead, looking for any sign of life, but there was nothing, just more darkness and abandoned buildings. Then, as I rounded a corner, I spotted a gas station up ahead. It was an old, run-down place, but the lights were on and there were a couple of cars parked out front. I felt a surge of hope. If I could just get there, maybe I could lose the car behind me, or at least find someone who could help. I sped up, heading straight for the gas station. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made my heart sink. The two cars parked outside weren't empty. There were people inside them, and they were watching me. I couldn't make out their faces in the dim light, but I could tell they were waiting for something, or someone. I didn't have time to think about it. I pulled into the gas station lot, my tires screeching on the pavement, and parked as close to the entrance as I could. The sedan that had been following me pulled in right behind me, blocking my car in. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I glanced around, trying to figure out what to do. The people in the other cars were still watching me, and I had a sinking feeling that they were somehow connected to the person who had been following me. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I needed to get out of there fast. I didn't bother turning off the engine. I just threw the car into reverse and slammed on the gas, trying to back out of the lot. But the sedan behind me didn't move, and I didn't have enough room to maneuver around it. I was trapped. Panic set in as I realized how dire the situation was. I could see the driver of the sedan getting out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and even in the low light I could tell he was someone you didn't want to mess with. He started walking towards me, and I knew I had only seconds to act. I slammed the car into drive and floored it, heading straight for the gas station's exit. But just as I reached the edge of the lot, one of the other cars pulled out in front of me, blocking my path. I hit the brakes, my heart racing as I realized there was no way out. The man from the sedan was getting closer, and I could see his face now, cold, expressionless, and focused entirely on me. He didn't seem to be in any hurry, and that made it even worse. He knew I was trapped, and he was taking his time. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing with panic. I thought about getting out and making a run for it, but I knew I wouldn't get far. There was nowhere to go, and the streets outside were dark and deserted. Just as the man reached my car, I did the only thing I could think of. I hit the horn, laying on it as hard as I could. The sound blared through the night, echoing off the buildings around us. For a split second, the man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he looked at me through the windshield. Then, to my surprise, he stopped. He glanced over his shoulder at the other cars, and I saw something in his expression change. He seemed to reconsider whatever he was about to do, and without another word, he turned and walked back to his sedan. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. As soon as he was out of the way, I hit the gas and sped out of the lot, swerving around the car that had blocked me in. My tires screeched on the pavement as I raced down the street, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from that place as fast as possible. I took the first turn I saw, then another and another, trying to put as much distance between me and that gas station as I could. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I found myself back on a main road. There were a few cars around, and I felt a small sense of relief wash over me. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't trapped. I kept driving, my hands still shaking on the wheel, until I saw a familiar landmark and realized I was near a police station. I pulled into the lot and parked, my heart still racing. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down and process what had just happened. I never saw those people again, and I have no idea what they wanted or why they were following me. Maybe it was a case of mistaken identity, or maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I was lucky to get out of there when I did. Last year, I was driving through Colorado, taking the scenic route through the mountains on my way to visit a friend in Denver. It was early fall, and the leaves were starting to change colors, painting the landscape in shades of red, orange, and yellow. The drive was breathtaking, with the road winding through dense forests and along steep cliffs that offered stunning views of the valleys below. I had started the day in Durango and planned to make it to Denver by evening, but I wasn't in a rush. I wanted to enjoy the scenery and maybe stop at a few lookout points along the way. The weather was a bit unpredictable, with the sun shining one minute and dark clouds rolling in the next, but that's pretty typical for the mountains. Around mid-afternoon, I found myself on a particularly narrow stretch of road that hugged the side of a mountain. It was one of those roads where you're almost on the edge, with nothing but a sheer drop on one side and a towering rock face on the other. The road twisted and turned, with hairpin curves that made it impossible to see what was coming around the corner. As I drove, the sky darkened and the wind picked up, howling through the trees and sending leaves swirling across the road. I was keeping a close eye on the weather, knowing that conditions could change rapidly in the mountains. The last thing I wanted was to get caught in a storm on this narrow, treacherous road. I was about halfway up the mountain when I noticed the first few rocks on the road. They weren't big, just small, loose stones that had likely been dislodged by the wind or rain. I swerved to avoid them, but my stomach tightened. This area was known for landslides, especially after heavy rain, and I knew I needed to be careful. The road climbed higher, the curves becoming sharper and more frequent. The wind was picking up even more, whipping through the trees and causing the branches to creak and groan. I could feel the tension in my body as I navigated each turn, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I was alone on the road with no other cars in sight, and the isolation only added to my growing unease. Then, as I rounded a particularly sharp curve, I heard it, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the mountain itself. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what it was, a landslide. I barely had time to react before the rocks started tumbling down the slope towards the road. The first few rocks were small, bouncing harmlessly off the pavement, but then larger ones followed, crashing down with terrifying force. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding slightly as I tried to stop in time. I could see the rocks coming down in my peripheral vision, a cascade of debris that threatened to sweep my car off the road. I managed to stop just in time, the car coming to a halt just as a large boulder crashed down onto the road in front of me. The impact shook the ground, and I watched in horror as more rocks and debris followed, blocking the road completely. For a moment I was frozen, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just happened. I was trapped, with the road blocked in front of me and the cliff on the other side. I quickly realized I couldn't stay where I was. The landslide wasn't over, and more rocks could come down at any moment. I threw the car into reverse, backing up as quickly as I could without losing control. I could still hear the rumbling, the sound of rocks and earth shifting above me, and I knew I had to get out of there before the road was completely buried. As I backed up, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the road behind me was still clear, but the rumbling was growing louder, and I knew I didn't have much time. I needed to find a place to pull off the road and wait out the landslide, but there was nowhere to go. The road was too narrow, and the drop-off too steep. Then I spotted it, a small turnout just ahead, barely wide enough for my car, but better than nothing. I backed up until I reached the turnout, then swung the car around, pulling into the narrow space as far as I could go. The car was perched precariously on the edge, with the front end just inches from the rock wall and the back end hanging over the drop. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel and trying to catch my breath. The rumbling had subsided, but I knew the danger wasn't over. I could still hear the occasional crash of rocks falling in the distance, and I was painfully aware that another landslide could happen at any moment. I didn't dare turn the car off. I wanted to be ready to move if I had to, but I also knew I couldn't go anywhere until the road was clear. I was stuck, trapped between the mountain and the drop, with no choice but to wait and hope the worst was over. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The wind was still howling, and the sky had turned an ominous shade of gray, with thick clouds swirling overhead. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, watching for any signs of movement, but all I could see was the pile of rocks and debris blocking the way. I was about to reach for my phone to call for help when I heard it again, the deep, ominous rumble of the mountain shifting. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized another landslide was coming, and this one sounded even bigger than the last. I knew I had to get out of there. I didn't have time to think. I just threw the car into gear and floored it, pulling out of the turnout and speeding down the road in reverse. The rumbling grew louder, and I could see the rocks starting to fall again, crashing down onto the road behind me. I was going too fast, the car swerving dangerously as I tried to keep it under control. I knew I couldn't keep this up. I had to find a way to turn around, but the road was too narrow and the drop-off too steep. The only option was to keep going, praying that I could outrun the landslide. The rocks were falling faster now, and I could see them in my mirrors, tumbling down the slope and bouncing off the road. One of them hit the back of the car with a loud thud, and I felt the impact shudder through the vehicle. I couldn't keep this up much longer. The road was too treacherous, and I was running out of room. Then, just as I thought I was about to be buried, the rumbling stopped. The rocks stopped falling, and the mountain went silent. I didn't dare stop. I kept going until I reached a wider section of road where I finally managed to turn the car around and drive back the way I had come. I didn't stop until I was well away from the landslide zone, my heart still pounding and my hands shaking on the wheel. When I finally pulled over to the side of the road, I could barely believe what had just happened. I had come within inches of being buried alive, trapped on that mountain road with no way out. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm down and gather my thoughts. I knew I couldn't go any further, not with the road blocked and the risk of more landslides. I had no choice but to turn back and find another way to Denver, even if it meant adding hours to my trip. When I finally got back on the road, I was hyper alert, every sound and movement setting my nerves on edge. The drive back down the mountain was slow and tense, but I eventually made it back to a safer stretch of road. I didn't feel truly safe until I was miles away from the mountains, back on the open highway with the city lights of Denver in the distance. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.